everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Goele Scheers, and I know my name looks different on the screen when you hear it, but don't worry, I listen to anything that comes close to it. So if we get to the question and answer section, then just give it a try. So I will walk you through my presentation. What I will talk to you about today is outcome harvesting and how it makes invisible changes visible. I will talk a bit about what outcome harvesting is, when you can use it, and also about the future of outcome harvesting a little bit at the end. So I want you to leave here to have an understanding of how the method works. If there's anything you would like to know, feel free to ask your questions at the end of the presentation. So let's dive in. So to start with, why outcome harvesting? So as Brad already mentioned a bit about how outcome harvesting came into existence. So first of all, the definition of outcome harvesting is that it's a tool to identify, formulate, analyze, and interpret outcomes to answer monitoring or evaluation questions. So it's indeed developed by a bunch of people, practitioners. So it's really developed from the ground up based on an existing need that there was. And the lead developer who took it forward is Ricardo Wilson Grau. It's inspired, as Brett said, by outcome mapping and utilization-focused evaluation as developed by Michael Quinn Patton. Before I go deeper into what outcome harvesting is, I just want to start from a personal story, how I came to outcome harvesting, or I came to contribute to developing outcome harvesting. I was working at a time at an organization working on conflict prevention and peace building. And we had some problems with measuring our change or making our change visible, because how do you actually prove, that a conflict, that you solve the conflict? And until you did that, a lot of time has passed, and many things have happened along the way. So there was quite some frustration in the organization that we're not able to make our changes visible. So this is where there were a lot of questions about, can we do it differently? Is there another way of doing this? So it relates a bit to the cartoon that you see here, that people felt the pressure that they really had to wait to the big changes to come up, but unable to show all the changes along the way. It could be, for example, that when you have a community that's in conflict, that some of the things that are changing is that people between communities start going to use the common local market again together, for example. It doesn't mean the conflict is solved, but it means that there's a change happening and that is moving towards solving a conflict. Or, for example, that people are celebrating from different religions, or celebrating the holidays together, for example, or invite each other to their houses. So these are all changes that are happening without the big change immediately happening, but these are very important. And I heard this from a lot of organizations, and I still hear it a lot. So we know that change is happening, is what people say, but it doesn't fit our indicators. It wasn't in our log frame. It's intangible. It's about, for example, political or relational changes. And also, it just didn't happen only because of us, these changes. So this was something that people shared. And also this, for example, is a results framework, which most of you will be familiar with. So this is what a lot of organizations plan for and also get funded for. So this assumes linearity. So it assumes that you go from your input to your impact, and it takes place in that way. But as many of you might be familiar with, it doesn't rarely happen really in that way, but this might be more what you encounter when you really go and implement your work. So you will have your inputs, but then your activities, some of them may go as planned, others not. Your outputs the same way. You may have some outcomes that are expected, others that are unexpected, until you finally reach your vision. So that is more a picture of reality. It's more complex. So it just doesn't happen always in a linear way, but very often it's more complex than that. So to respond to that, so all these practitioners that I mentioned at the beginning developed outcome harvesting as a different way of looking at change, and something that could add to what they were missing when they looked at their results. So outcome harvesting actually asks the question differently. So it doesn't assume the linearity, as in the previous picture that I showed, going from your inputs to your outputs, but it starts by asking about the change. So the question that outcome harvesting asks is, what has actually changed, and how did we contribute to that change? So it moves from focusing on what is done to focusing on what is achieved. And that's often a paradigm shift for people. It's a different way of thinking because we're usually used to really think about what have we actually done? What kind of activities have we done? Did they go well? That's what our starting point for looking at change. But outcome harvesting really thinks about what has actually been achieved. So usually this is the first thing that people have to get used to, that we turn their thinking a bit around and start from the actual change. So basically outcome harvesting works backwards. So it starts from the actual change that has happened, and then it works backwards, trying to find out how or who contributed to that change. So it's a bit like detective work where a murder has happened and then the detective is trying to find out who contributed to the murder. So it's a similar way how outcome harvesting works, but hopefully without a murder involved. And so basically in outcome harvesting, there's no measurement of progress towards predetermined results. So that basically means that from the moment when you start collecting your data, your outcomes, or harvesting of outcomes, as we call it in outcome harvesting, you don't start from your planning framework. But you start by looking at the actual changes that are there, that have happened. And we do this because we also want to capture the unexpected changes. Because if we only start from the planning framework, we might miss out on a lot of things that have happened that we didn't plan for. And outcome harvesting does that by starting from the people who have changed, or the social actors who have changed. So this is really the starting point. So outcome harvesting is an actor-centered approach. And so basically, it's really thinking about who are the people that we have influenced through our work. I was just seeing the question, Samantha, that says, is there's a slide deck, but everybody sees my presentation, right? Yes, okay, good. So it's probably a question to have the slide deck. Okay, we'll talk about that later. So basically we start from these actors, and then the question outcome harvesting is, what are these actors doing differently? So who has changed is the social actors. Those can be individuals. It can also be a group or a community that is changing. It can be an institution or an organization. So it's not just an individual. And what is changing? So we call it a behavioral change, but that can entail a change in practice, relationships, policies, and activities. So these are the changes. So we start from the actors and we ask ourselves, what are they doing differently? So the focus in outcome harvesting is on outcomes, as the name says it. So it means it doesn't look at your activities or outputs, not in the sense that we don't look at how well they were carried out. We will look at outcomes, at activities and outputs in the way as how they contributed to the outcomes. And so the same as for impact. So outcome harvesting really focuses on the outcome level. So are outcomes important? I think this cartoon says it all. So it says here, brilliant surgery, well done. It's just a shame the patient died. So you can have activities that have been carried out really well, but if the outcome after that, the effect is not a good one, a positive one, then you may be in trouble. So basically, outcome harvesting is a bit that black box in the middle of your activities, outputs, and the impact level, which is very often a step that we skip, and we just make the assumption that something happens there, and then we have our impact. But so outcome harvesting tries to unpack that black box and really looks at the outcomes that have been achieved. Only the outcomes, only the changes in social actors are not enough in this case. So there also needs to be a contribution from your work. In outcome harvesting, we don't talk about attribution because we recognize the fact that if a change happens, it's rarely because of one organization or one person doing something that a change happens, but there's usually more actors and factors involved. So that's why we talk about contribution. So we try to define what the contribution was, whether it was a big or a small contribution. We describe that in outcome harvesting. So based on that, we get to the definition of what we call an outcome in outcome harvesting. So an outcome in outcome harvesting is an observable change in a social actor's behavior that is significant and that has been influenced by your intervention. So we're always talking about an observable change, so something that has happened already. It's not about a planned outcome. So outcome harvesting is a tool for monitoring and evaluation. So we're looking at the outcomes that have already happened. That are significant, and so that you actually contributed to through your work. So that's the thinking behind outcome harvesting, and the way it is operationalized is through the 5 steps of outcome harvesting. So these are 5 steps that you can implement if you use outcome harvesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to implement all the 5 steps. You always have to adapt it to your context. To make it work for you. There might be some people who've read about outcome harvesting already who came across 6 steps. I use 5 steps because I combine the document review in step number 2, the harvesting of outcomes. So these are the 5 steps of outcome harvesting, so of the outcome harvesting process. And I will briefly take you through each of the steps so that you get an understanding of what these steps are about. So basically, the first step in outcome harvesting is the designing the harvest. So basically, in an outcome harvesting design, the idea is that you describe how the outcome harvesting process will be done, which is the case for many methods that you use, that you first make a plan. In outcome harvesting, we also put a focus on defining who the users and users are of the evaluation or the monitoring findings. Because as said, this is inspired by utilization-focused evaluation. So it's very important to, as a first starting point, make sure that you know who are the users, so who will use the findings and what will they actually use it for, so that you don't collect information that you will not use later on. It sounds pretty obvious, but it's still very often not done in that way. And outcome harvesting design is not static because outcome harvesting is an emergent process. So some decisions may only be taken later in the process. But the idea is that you develop this design, this plan for outcome harvesting together with your users. It's a participatory approach. So the idea is that the users are involved in taking the decisions. So here's just an example of from ActionAid Denmark, who defined their users. So in the middle, you see the users, so the leadership and program managers of ActionAid, the M&E unit as primary users as well, then ActionAid International and also the country offices and their users, as you see, can be different. So it can be for learning or input into the new program design or to inform the new M&E system or to guide country-level work, for example. Some examples of evaluation questions in this case. So looking at in which social actors is ActionAid influencing change. And then there's an accountability question looking at what was the progress towards the strategic objectives. So what do the outcomes show in terms of that progress? And how did the tax justice program contribute to these outcomes? To what extent do the outcomes show that the work of ActionAid on tax justice is locally rooted, which is something that they really wanted to know about because they assume that most of their work is locally rooted. And are there any linkages between the local, national, regional, and global level of advocacy? So that's step number 1. So after that, you go into the harvesting of outcomes, which is really the data collection step in outcome harvesting. And this can be done in various ways. You already see a picture here from a workshop in Senegal, a USAID workshop. And how do you formulate outcome statements? So there's a very specific way in outcome harvesting that you define an outcome. So it's not just a piece of text, but there are specific rules, guidelines of how you formulate the outcome statements, because in the end, you want them to be objectively verifiable. That means that everybody should go and be able to check those outcomes independently of who formulated them, and it should be the same result. So an outcome statement, as we call it, so that's the full outcome, the outcome statement, has 3 elements. An outcome description, significance, and contribution description. I will show you an example in a bit, but just to mention the elements. So the outcome description, the first part, is really about the change in a social actor, and it always has 4 elements. It describes who changed, what changed, so what is this social actor doing differently, when and where did it happen. The significance then describes why it is important, and the contribution is actually about the activities and the outputs of your intervention. So how did your program or project contribute to this change? So this is an example. In this case, it's about input in a law. So you see the 3 different elements here. Just to go through this one, so it says in July 2018, the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection of Mongolia involved 13 disabled people's organizations in the drafting of a chapter on persons with disabilities in the employment promotion law through a technical sub-working group. So it's about DPOs getting input, being able to give input into a law. It's significant because the implementation of the law will increase the level of integration of persons with disabilities into the labor market. Before, they had not been directly involved in the legislation process of the law, but of course it's crucial so that their views can be included. Previously, there was also no dialogue between the ministry and the DPOs. The contribution in this case of the organization was that in May 2018, the DPOs submitted a lobby paper to the ministry to make recommendations for the labor law. And during 3 meetings in June 2018, the partner here met with the ministry and lobbied to organize a meeting of the sub-working group to support the drafting of the concerned chapter. And they also provided technical and logistical support to support the ministry. So this is what a full outcome statement looks like. I deliberately did not choose the highest change just to show you that other changes are important as well. Right? So this may be a first step in a change process where the DPOs are involved in the law, and then the next step may be that there's actually a revision of the law based on their input. So basically you have to really see it as a change process. So there might be change happening next year or next month, there might be another change happening, another actor might change in a different way. So you will have a set of outcomes that are all connected to each other, and I tell you a bit more about the change process. Just to give you another example here on a different level, so outcome harvesting can be applied on different levels. So we had the previous example with a law change, and here it's about a community where parents of children with cerebral palsy are sending their children to mainstream schools for their education, whereas previously they were denied access to education. And so here there was a contribution by the organization who conducted awareness raising training to the parents of these children. So that's on a very different level, but again, a change in a social actor's behavior. So this harvesting of outcomes happens under the guidance or the facilitation of a harvester, as we call it. So the harvester helps really in identifying and formulating the outcomes. If you try it yourself, you will see that it looks easy if you read the outcome statements, but if you try and formulate them yourself, it takes a bit more time, because it's not just it's not just a vague description of the change saying women are more empowered now, but it's really going into what does it actually mean? What are the observable active changes in behavior that are happening? So if you harvest outcomes, you can start from a document review. So basically it means that you go through the documents and see any documentation that an organization has or a project has to see if there have been any outcomes already in those. So that's an option as a starting point. But what's important is that you also really engage with people who have the knowledge, so the sources, as we call them, of the information, who can tell you what the changes have been that have happened. So these can be people who are part of the project team, who are implementers. It can also be the social actors themselves, for example, who describe the changes. So anybody who has really the knowledge on the outcomes, on the changes, and who contributed to them. So here you can see that these people are really happy with their outcomes. So this is harvesting in a workshop. So this is a way of harvesting your outcomes. It's by engaging with people through a workshop. You can also have interviews face-to-face, online, focus group discussions, via email. You can also harvest outcomes like that. So there's, all the options that you have there, and it's for you to decide which way would be the best one to engage with people. If you use it for monitoring, for example, so to regularly look at how your work is evolving, then it may also be that after a while it's too much to use Excel, for example, and then sometimes organizations also move to databases, collaborative databases in this case, because it's a participatory method, so people need to be able to engage on their outcomes. Some examples of that are Podio, TAPAP, etc. Here on the screen you see Podio, so these are different outcomes from Action 8 in this case in the Podio database, and everybody's able to comment on these outcomes in the database. So that's an interactive way on working to work on the outcomes. The next step is to substantiate the outcome statements. So we saw in the previous step the actual harvesting of outcomes, that you can also engage with the implementing partners, so the people who were involved in the implementation of the activities. And in the next step, substantiation, this is where you go to independent third parties. And the reason to do so is because Hopefully, by the way they have been defined, they should be pretty correct, but there can always be a nuance in the way people have formulated the outcomes, and it may look a bit differently than the reality. So that is why with substantiation, that's actually the process where you take a number of the outcomes. So it doesn't need to be all the outcomes, but you take a sample of the outcomes, and you can consult independent people or documents to actually ensure the accuracy or understanding or both of the outcome statements. So that you can actually use them in the way you intended to use them. So this is really going to independent third parties. The way you do so is by asking a simple question. So substantiation is not rocket science. It's basically asking the question, okay, here's the outcome statement. To what extent do you agree that this information is accurate? So you can start with the outcome description and then move to significance and contribution, and then seeing how far the substantiators, as we call it, agree with the outcome statements. And so you can also check documentation, because for many outcomes it may be that you can also find the information in documents. For example, if it would be a law change, then of course that will be publicly available and you would be able to check it that way as well. It may be more difficult for the contribution to find it in documentation. Then the next step is analysis and interpretation. So analysis and outcome harvesting, as with many qualitative methods, is thinking, okay, we have all these outcome statements here. Now, how do we actually make sense with them? How can we actually answer our monitoring and evaluation questions with all these stories, these outcome statements that we have? So the first thing to do is to organize the outcomes by categories, so that you can really see the trends and patterns in these outcomes. Whereas if we go to interpretation, it means that now what does it actually mean? So if we have our numbers for the categories and we have the text, the different outcome statement, what does it actually mean? So here you provide evidence-based answers to the monitoring or evaluation questions that you have set at the very beginning. So this is where you go back. So remember at the beginning, we've said that you let go of your planning framework. So outcome harvesting does not start from the planning framework where you do your actual harvesting, because you want to be able to capture unexpected results. But when you get to the analysis and interpretation, this is where you can bring your planning framework back in, and you can compare what you've harvested with your planning framework, which is always an interesting exercise to do and look at the difference. Just to give you an example from ActionAid here again, so if you cluster the outcomes, if you categorize them, for example, if you look at the left one, the change level, we can see that most outcomes that they've achieved were on the national level. And if we look at the locally rooted, which was important to them, we could actually see that not so many of the outcomes were locally rooted, which was an interesting insight for them, because their assumption was really that all the work that they do is locally rooted. Whereas here they realized that actually, because this was a program on tax justice, which is quite a complex subject, that it was not so much possible in this case. Which is also why, if you look at the contribution, that one of their strategies, for example, the Inspirator one, had less of an effect in terms of the outcomes. So this is what you can immediately see. If you do the categorization, you can see where the trends and patterns are. But it doesn't end here with these graphs for an outcome harvesting. So you always have to look what's behind the numbers as well. So this is where you go into the actual outcomes and you look at how they are connected. So this may be too small to read, but it's just to show you the picture. So it's part of their outcomes, in this case on double taxation treaties, looking at how they connect to each other. So which outcome influenced which other change? So how did it lead to another change? And what was the contribution to these changes that led actually to these changes? So that's looking at really the connections between the outcomes. Or to put it differently, here is an example. So you can use different frameworks to look at your outcomes. So here it's looking at were most of the changes individual or rather systemic, were they formal or informal, did they relate to laws and policies, social norms, etc. So this gives you a quick insight of where the trends and patterns are if you look at your outcomes. But again, outcome harvesting is a participatory approach, so it shouldn't just be done, the analysis and interpretation by one person, one individual sitting behind a computer, but do engage the people, the users, etc., or the sources as much as possible in the analysis and interpretation as well. And the reason is really also because then, they keep their motivation. So it's motivating and inspiring to do so, because if they only harvest outcomes and only deliver the information, they will lose their interest after a while. But if you engage the people, they really get motivated. It goes beyond actually simply reporting for them. And also they have a better understanding of the monitoring or evaluation report at the end. And of course, they own the outcomes and the process better. And so here you can see that they really got enthusiastic because they also categorized themselves here. So here are some other pictures of analysis and interpretation done in workshops. So you could, for example, do this outcome map that I showed you on the wall and have people play around with it, compare it to their theory of change, for example. Or here on the right-hand side, they're comparing it to the program objectives, because it's people working in different projects. So how does this actually all add up? So it's really getting these insights of actually working with the outcomes. And then finally, support use, or getting back to where we started at the beginning. Again, it seems obvious, but usually not so much attention is paid to it. So producing a report is not the purpose of M&E. It's interesting to read the report, but of course you have to use what's in it. So in your design, as I mentioned, you decide what your users will be and who will be your users. And we deliberately put this step here in outcome harvesting to make sure that there's somebody who's also supporting these user findings. So somebody's engaging with all the users to making sure that they actually take decisions or use the findings for what was decided in the design. So this can be done through participatory workshops, presentations, summaries, etc. Now, so those were the steps of outcome harvesting. So I hope you got a bit of an idea of how outcome harvesting works. And again, it needs to be adapted to your work if you use it. So outcome harvesting is flexible in that. Of course, every method has its niche, has a specific way where it can be applied. So where outcome harvesting shines is actually when, of course, you want to know more about your outcomes. If you only want to know about your outputs, of course, outcome harvesting is not the right method for you. Also, if learning or adaptation is important for you, so outcome harvesting can be used both for accountability as well as for learning, but there's always the learning aspect in outcome harvesting. So if your programming context is unpredictable and complex, then definitely outcome harvesting is very useful for you. You should have time and resources to engage in a participatory process because you really have to keep that in mind. You involve people, you work together with people to make this happen, which always takes a bit more time than a desk review, for example, unless it's a very big desk review. But so do keep that in mind before you start. And also, of course, outcome harvesting is applied to monitoring or evaluation. It's not a planning method. So that's where I get to where it's not useful. So you can't use it for planning. But you have outcome mapping, which has a planning method based on the same thinking. So the niche, as said, is really focusing on these outcomes measured as behavioral changes. So if you're looking for changes in attitude or knowledge changes, this will not be measured by outcome harvesting. But there are different methods that you can use. And often outcome harvesting is used together with other methods as well to know everything you want to know. It's not so useful for value for money. It will give you some input on value for money, but it won't give you the full picture. Also, when you have a tried and proven model, which means that you have done a certain project over and over again and you know what's going to come out, then outcome harvesting, you can still use it, but it may not be the most useful tool for you. So same with direct service delivery. If it's, for example, handing out material in refugee camps, those are things that you can also count, for example. You can't use outcome harvesting for that. But if you, for example, also do capacity building in those refugee camps, then you would be able to use outcome harvesting for that. So it doesn't mean that it's not applicable to everything of your work, but it may be applicable to some parts of your work and not to others. So to end and talk a bit about the future direction of outcome harvesting. So outcome harvesting has been around for quite a while, for about 20 years now. So it's used in real-time learning. It's combined with other methods. It's used by major donors around the world. It's embedded in adaptive management. So all of that is happening at the moment. But of course, I think what's happening now at the moment and will happen more is to look at how outcome harvesting can be used together with AI, which is coming up for many of the evaluation methods, thinking about how that will work. Of course, it's also very interesting to see how it will work with outcome harvesting because of the fact that it's actually a participatory approach, and that's the big challenge that we can look at here. So how do we make sure if we use those new tools that we don't lose what actually makes outcome harvesting meaningful? So that's something to think about. I've developed a bot to harvest outcomes. So if you're interested in that, you can always email me. But so it actually helps you in refining your outcome statements or if in identifying outcomes from your documents, for example. Why does visibility matters now? Well, I think we're living at the moment in a moment when international development is increasingly questioned. That's the field that I work in most, but it actually also relates to other fields that are being attacked. So some of these things, or to a large extent, that's political, but I still think that there's a part that we can also help with because much of what international development actually does happens quietly. So it changes how people relate to each other. It's about shifting who's listening to who. It opens space for dialogue where there was silence. And too often we try to explain these complex human or political changes using metrics that we never designed to actually capture it. So outcome harvesting, in that sense, is actually more important now than ever because it really makes visible what would otherwise remain invisible. It helps us to really tell this full story. It gives language to influence, contribution, emergence, but it does document your real change with rigor. So it's not just a bunch of stories, it really outcome changes with rigor. And it allows us to tell objectively verifiable stories about how change actually happens. So it's not that I'm claiming this should be instead of numbers, but because numbers are not enough to show the changes that we are actually achieving. So if we want the value of international development and also other fields to be really understood, we first have to learn to make it visible. So that's my talk about outcome harvesting. And I want to end with just showing you the book on outcome harvesting, which Ricardo Wilson Grau developed just before he passed away. And then there's also the outcome harvesting community, which is a rich online community. And let me just type it here, outcomeharvesting.net before I make a typo. Okay, so the outcome harvesting community is, well, first of all, you can see a website with a lot of resources on there. But if you go to the forum, you can actually engage in discussions on outcome harvesting with a lot of practitioners. So we have thousands of people around the world who are using outcome harvesting or who are interested in using outcome harvesting. So if you want to, you can sign up and you can take part in those discussions. I'm one of the outcome harvesting community facilitators. And we will actually also have a meeting, a face-to-face meeting in Tanzania in July this year. So look out for that if you're interested in outcome harvesting. So with that, I want to say thank you very much for joining today and for listening to my talk on outcome harvesting.